Corporal Elias Thorne pressed his spine against the shattered ferrocrete of the trench. He used to think the sky over Planet Reach looked like spun glass, fragile and brilliantly blue. Now it was a suffocating, violent orange. The atmosphere itself was burning, torn apart by the apocalyptic superlasers of the Covenant fleet hovering in the ionosphere. Ash drifted down like gray snow, coating the visors of the dead Marines sprawled around him. Thorne gripped his empty magnum, his hands shaking so violently the metal rattled against his chest plate. He was 19 years old. He hadn't even finished his basic orbital drop training before the invasion alarm screamed. His dominant belief, hammered into him over the last 48 hours of endless slaughter, was simple and paralyzing. Humanity was already dead. The UNSC was just delaying the math. But what if the universe's most desperate cry for help bypassed the heavens entirely? What if the salvation of Reach didn't come from a Spartan, but from the King of the Dead? What if the Emperor of Shadows answered the call? The ground shuddered, a rhythmic, sickening vibration that rattled Thorne's teeth inside his skull. The heavy infantry of the Covenant was advancing. Through the thick, acrid smoke of burning Scorpion tanks, the terrifying silhouettes of elite warriors emerged. Their energy shields flared with a harsh, blinding luminescence, deflecting the desperate, scattered gunfire of the surviving UNSC forces. Beside them marched the brutes, towering mountains of muscle and rage, roaring with a bloodlust that physically hurt the ears. The audio of the battlefield was a chaotic symphony of destruction. The high-pitched, ozone-scented screech of plasma rifles, the thunderous detonations of plasma mortars, and the wet, horrifying crunch of human armor buckling under alien strength. Thorne pressed his hands over his ears, but he couldn't block out the sound of his squad leader being vaporized. The line was breaking. The command network in Thorne's earpiece was a chorus of static and screaming. There were no reinforcements. There was no extraction. There was only the ash, the heat, and the overwhelming weight of extinction pressing down on the ash plains. Then a sound cut through the chaos. It was distinctly human, beautifully mechanical, and incredibly violent. The heavy, rhythmic thud of half a ton of armor hitting the ground. A towering figure clad in olive-drab titanium alloy stepped into the clearing, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that defied his massive bulk. Master Chief, Spartan 117, he was a lone monolith standing against the rising tide of an alien apocalypse. His MA-5B assault rifle roared, a staccato rhythm of armor-piercing rounds that found the unshielded skulls of the Covenant vanguard. Every trigger pull was an execution. For a fleeting, breathless second, Thorne felt a spark of something impossible ignite in his chest. Hope. He watched the mythological savior of humanity weave through plasma fire, his energy shield flaring golden as he physically shattered the jaw of an elite with the butt of his rifle. But the spark of hope in Thorne's heart was quickly drowned in the sheer mathematical reality of the swarm. For every alien the Spartan dropped, five more poured from the phantom dropships descending from the burning sky. The situation deteriorated with horrifying speed. Thorne watched from the mud as the Spartan was pushed back, step by agonizing step. Over the open, scrambled comms channel, the panicked, synthetic voice of the AI, Cortana, bled through the static, echoing in Thorne's helmet. She was warning the chief, her voice laced with a very human terror. His energy shields were failing, down to 15%. Artillery was completely depleted. They were standing in the center of a kill box, and the Covenant was preparing to glass the entire grid. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, oppressive gravity. A brute chieftain, a monstrous behemoth scarred by decades of holy war, pushed his way to the front of the pack. In his massive, armored hands, he wielded a gravity hammer, a weapon capable of flattening heavily armored personnel carriers into scrap metal. The chieftain roared, a sound that vibrated in Thorne's chest cavity, and raised the colossal weapon high above his head, aiming directly for the battered, exhausted Spartan. Thorne squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to watch the legend die. But the sickening crunch of titanium never came. Instead, the battlefield was instantly plunged into a dead, unnatural silence. The screech of plasma, the roar of the brute, the chaotic rumble of the dropships. It all vanished, replaced by a cold, vacuum-like stillness that made Thorne's ears pop. He opened his eyes. The space directly above the killing field was fracturing. It wasn't the blinding, sterile blue flash of a UNSC slipspace rupture. This was something entirely wrong. The air itself was tearing open, revealing a jagged, bleeding wound in reality. It was a tear of absolute, impenetrable blackness, thick and cold as the deepest ocean abyss. The ambient temperature on the burning plains plummeted instantly, turning the sweat on Thorne's face to frost. From the depths of that boundless void, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't an alien monstrosity. It was a young man, clad in a long black trench coat, descending upon a battlefield of giants. His eyes burned with a searing, ethereal blue light, radiating a pressure so immense, so utterly godly, that Thorne forgot how to breathe. The physical rules of the universe seemed to pause, gagging on the anomaly. The brute chieftain's hammer, descending with enough kinetic force to crater the planet's crust, froze mere inches from Master Chief's visor. The golden flare of the Spartan's failing shields locked in place, suspended like a photograph. Thorne stared, utterly paralyzed, his mind unable to comprehend the visual data his eyes were feeding him. It wasn't a localized stasis field. It was as if time itself had recoiled in absolute terror from whatever was clawing its way into existence. Even the blazing orange superlasers in the upper atmosphere appeared to stagnate, their destructive beams stuttering against the sudden influx of an unknown cosmic weight. Inside Thorne's helmet, the tactical HUD flickered wildly, violently throwing error codes. His vitals monitor beeped a flat, continuous warning, misinterpreting the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure as a total environmental failure. The scent of ozone and burning flesh was instantly overwritten by the smell of ancient, undisturbed dust and cold, damp earth, the smell of a freshly dug grave. Over the static-laced comms, Cortana's voice returned, but she wasn't speaking to the chief anymore. She was muttering rapidly, a stream of terrified, frantic calculations bleeding into the open channel. She was attempting to quantify the impossible. There were no Forerunner signatures, no Covenant radiation, no human telemetry. The energy bleeding from the black tear in the sky was violating every known law of thermodynamics. It wasn't just power, it was absolute authority. The young man in the black coat finally stepped off the edge of the void, his boots touching the ash-covered soil of Reach without making a single sound. The moment his feet made contact with the planet, the paralysis gripping the battlefield shattered. Time violently snapped back into motion. The brute chieftain, utterly confused by the spatial distortion, roared in fury and seamlessly redirected the catastrophic momentum of his gravity hammer away from the Spartan, bringing the massive, glowing head of the weapon crashing down directly toward the skull of the arrogant, unprotected human who had dared to interrupt his holy execution. Corporal Thorne gasped, finally drawing a breath of the freezing air, bracing for the inevitable spray of blood. The gravity hammer, a weapon that bent the fundamental forces of physics to crush armored columns, struck its target. But there was no explosion of gore. There was only a devastating, ear-splitting shockwave. A massive ring of displaced air and pulverized earth exploded outward, violently throwing Thorne backward against the trench wall and entirely clearing the smoke from the immediate battlefield. When the dust settled, the scene defied all logic. The young man hadn't moved. He hadn't dodged. He simply stood there, his coat billowing wildly in the chaotic winds. One pale, ungloved hand was raised above his head. He had caught the head of the gravity hammer bare-handed. The kinetic energy that should have liquefied him had simply ceased to exist, absorbed into the void of his presence. The brute chieftain, a towering apex predator of the Covenant, strained with every ounce of his colossal strength, his muscles bulging against his armor, but the weapon would not budge a single millimeter. For the first time since the invasion began, Thorne saw something he never thought possible. He saw fear in the posture of the Covenant. The surrounding elite warriors, usually paragons of arrogant religious zealotry, instinctively took a step back. Their mandibles clicked nervously, their plasma rifles wavering. Master Chief immediately recognized the tactical shift. The Spartan didn't lower his weapon, but he broke his defensive stance, smoothly stepping to the side to create a triangulated line of sight on the new anomaly. The young man in the coat didn't even look at the struggling brute above him. His glowing blue eyes lazily scanned the burning horizon, taking in the alien armada and the slaughtered Marines. A profound, terrifying calmness radiated from him. Then, with a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, the impossible happened. The dense alien alloy of the gravity hammer's head groaned in protest. Metal shrieked. With a sickening crunch, the indestructible weapon simply crumpled, imploding under the crushing grip of the young man's bare fingers, leaving the brute chieftain holding nothing but a jagged, useless handle. The chieftain stared at the shattered remnant of his weapon, his primitive brain failing to process the violation of his physical reality. Before the beast could even register the loss, the young man simply pushed his palm forward. It wasn't a punch. It was a dismissal. A concussive blast of invisible kinetic force erupted from the casual motion. The impact caught the massive brute square in the chestplate. The heavy armor caved inward instantly. The multi-ton monster was violently launched backward, skipping across the ashen ground like a discarded stone, flying dozens of meters before slamming into the jagged face of a sheer cliff. The rock shattered upon impact, burying the alien commander in a shower of boulders and dust. Absolute suffocating silence reclaimed the ash plains. Thousands of Covenant soldiers stood frozen. Corporal Thorne clutched his rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. His previous certainty that humanity was destined to be erased was suddenly eclipsed by a new, far more terrifying realization. They weren't just meat waiting to be glassed anymore. They were witnesses to the arrival of a true God. The surviving human Marines, scattered and broken across the cratered landscape, slowly began to pull themselves from the mud. Thorne forced his trembling legs to hold his weight, peeking over the lip of the blasted trench. He looked at the Spartan, the towering green giant who was supposed to be the ultimate weapon of their species. Even Master Chief seemed dwarfed by the sheer, imposing gravity of the stranger in black. The air around the young man began to distort, radiating a bone-chilling aura that made the fires of Reach seem entirely insignificant. Thorne realized his breath was pluming into thick white clouds. The ambient temperature was still dropping rapidly. The stranger hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't spoken a word. Yet the entire ecosystem of the battlefield had irreversibly shifted. The Covenant, an empire that spanned galaxies and conquered star systems, was no longer the apex predator on this planet. The shadow of death had literally descended upon the ash plains, and as Thorne stared at the glowing blue eyes of the monarch, he knew the rules of this universe had just been permanently rewritten, and the slaughter was only just beginning. The absolute silence that had gripped the ash plains shattered like brittle glass. The Covenant forces, recovering from the localized spatial distortion that had crippled their commander, reacted with the ingrained fanatical discipline of a holy armada. Hundreds of towering elite warriors, their mandibles clicking in a chaotic symphony of alien panic and religious outrage, leveled their weapons at the lone figure in the black coat. Corporal Elias Thorne flattened himself against the mud of his trench, his hands clamped over his helmet. He knew what was coming. It was the synchronized firing of a vanguard execution line. The ambient air temperature spiked violently as hundreds of plasma rifles and heavy fuel rod cannons charged simultaneously. The blinding neon blue and sickly green glare of superheated ionized gas illuminated the swirling dust, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the blasted terrain. Thorne squeezed his eyes shut. No human armor, not even the Mjolnir shielding of a Spartan, could survive the concentrated thermal output of an entire battalion. The stranger was going to be vaporized into radioactive steam. The alien weaponry erupted. It was a deafening, continuous roar of tearing ozone and explosive heat, a tidal wave of plasma, bright enough to sear the retinas through polarized visors, converged on the single coordinate where the young man stood. The kinetic impact of the bombardment shook the bedrock of Planet Reach. Clods of boiling earth and molten rock rained down on Thorne's armor. The young Marine held his breath, waiting for the inevitable shockwave of the stranger's destruction. But the shockwave never came. The blinding light of the plasma barrage abruptly dimmed, swallowed by an impossible, expanding darkness. Thorne risked opening his eyes, peering through the thick, toxic smoke. His jaw went slack. The stranger was still there. He hadn't raised a shield. He hadn't moved. The superheated plasma bolts, capable of melting heavily armored scorpions into slag, were simply dissipating inches from his body, vanishing into a swirling black mist that clung to his coat like a living entity. The energy wasn't being deflected. It was being consumed. The young man in the black coat exhaled a slow, quiet sigh that somehow echoed over the roaring bombardment. He slowly raised his head, his glowing blue eyes piercing through the thick smoke, locking onto the sprawling alien army. The Covenant warriors faltered, their weapons sputtering as their thermal cores overheated. A wave of palpable icy dread washed over the battlefield. Thorne felt it in his marrow. It was a primal, suffocating terror that bypassed logic and went straight to the lizard brain. The stranger opened his mouth. He spoke a single word. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a command, delivered with a quiet, absolute authority that vibrated through the ground, up Thorne's boots, and directly into his chest cavity. Arise. The word hit the battlefield like a seismic charge. The orange, burning sky of Reach seemed to violently dim, as if the sun itself had been choked out. The ground beneath the stranger's boots began to boil. It didn't melt from heat. It dissolved into a sea of pitch-black, viscous shadow. The darkness spread outward with the speed of a shockwave, a creeping, unnatural tide that consumed the ash, the craters, and the mud. The temperature on the plains plummeted past freezing in a fraction of a second. Frost instantly crystallized on Thorne's visor. Then the shadows began to erupt. Geysers of dark, freezing energy shot into the air. From the inky depths of the spreading void, figures began to claw their way onto the physical plane. They poured out by the thousands. Towering knights clad in abyssal armor, their eye slits burning with the same chilling blue light as their master. A colossal insectoid nightmare burst from the ground with an ear-splitting shriek, its razor-sharp appendages twitching with lethal anticipation. A majestic, terrifying commander in heavy plate armor rose gracefully, a blood-red plume trailing from its helm, drawing a great sword that crackled with dark lightning, and above them all an angel of death with 6 shattered, blackened wings ascended, bringing with it an aura of absolute despair. Thorne pressed his back harder against the trench wall, his breath coming in shallow, hyperventilating gasps. The sheer scale of the Shadow Army was incomprehensible, but the true horror, the anomaly that finally broke Thorne's understanding of the universe, was happening right in front of him. The corpses of the Covenant soldiers, the very elites and grunts that had slaughtered his squad minutes ago, began to twitch. The massive dead bodies were suddenly engulfed in a halo of freezing blue-black fire. Thorne watched in paralyzed terror as a dead brute, half its skull blown away by Spartan fire, slowly pushed itself off the ground. The creature's flesh dissolved into swirling dark smoke, replaced by jagged, shadowy armor. It stood at attention, its glowing eyes fixed forward, radiating a silent, absolute loyalty to the young man in the coat. The dead were not at rest. Death itself had been weaponized, the ultimate consequence, the absolute finality that every soldier accepted when they strapped on their boots, had just been casually erased. A panicked Marine next to Thorne, a kid named Miller who was bleeding from a shrapnel wound, screamed hysterically. Miller fumbled for his assault rifle, aiming wildly at the rising shadow corpses, his finger tightening on the trigger. Thorne didn't think. He acted on pure survival instinct. He lunged forward, slamming his gauntlet over the receiver of Miller's rifle and dragging the screaming boy down into the mud. "Don't shoot," Thorne hissed, his voice cracking with terror. "For God's sake, do not pull that trigger. They aren't looking at us." It was a tiny choice, a desperate gamble by a broken human soldier, but it was the only thing keeping them alive. Thorne realized with chilling clarity that if they drew the attention of the dark swarm, they would be unmade in seconds. They were no longer combatants in this war. They were microscopic insects observing a clash of titans. The slaughter began without a single order being shouted. The Shadow Army crashed into the Covenant lines like a tsunami of jagged obsidian. The audio of the battlefield shifted from the sharp, sterile crack of plasma to the wet, visceral sounds of tearing metal and crushing bone. The giant insectoid shadow, Beru, launched himself into the air, moving faster than the human eye could track. He slammed into the armored hull of a hovering Wraith artillery tank. With a horrifying screech, his shadowy claws sheared through the impenetrable alien plating as if it were wet paper, dragging the screaming pilots out into the open air before decapitating them in a blur of motion. Igris, the red-plumed knight, waded into a phalanx of elite zealots. The elites ignited their energy swords, roaring their war cries, but their weapons simply passed through the dark armor of the knight. Igris swung his greatsword in a devastating arc, a silent flash of dark lightning that cleaved through energy shields, kinetic barriers, and alien armor alike, cutting 3 towering elites in half with a single elegant stroke. The Covenant, an empire that had conquered the stars through overwhelming religious zeal and technological supremacy, broke. For the first time in their recorded history, the alien invaders experienced true, unfiltered panic. They were fighting an enemy that felt no pain, required no ammunition, and simply reformed from the shadows every time they were struck down. It wasn't a battle, it was a mechanical, hyper-efficient extermination. Thorne watched through the cracked dirt of the trench, his stomach churning. He had spent months watching humanity get butchered by these monsters, but the sheer brutality of the shadows brought him no satisfaction. It was terrifying. The screaming of the aliens was raw and pitiable. Within a span of 10 minutes, a reinforced vanguard battalion that had pushed the UNSC to the brink of extinction was reduced to a graveyard of shredded metal and silent, creeping shadows. As the last Covenant dropship was dragged out of the sky by a swarm of winged horrors, the young man in the black coat finally moved. He raised a single hand and snapped his fingers. The sharp, acoustic crack echoed across the silent plains. Instantly, the sprawling army of tens of thousands of shadow warriors dissolved into black mist, racing across the ground to merge back into the single elongated shadow cast by his boots. The oppressive, freezing aura vanished, replaced by the mundane, burning heat of the planetary fires. The stranger turned slowly, his boots crunching on the ash, and began to walk toward the only other entity on the battlefield still standing, Master Chief. The surviving UNSC Marines shrank back into their craters, completely silent. Over the encrypted command frequency, the brass on the orbital defense platforms were losing their minds. Officers were screaming, demanding artillery strikes, containment protocols, anything to neutralize the unidentified anomaly that had just rewritten the laws of physics. But inside Master Chief's helmet, Cortana was frantically overriding their commands. She had spliced her voice directly into the local marine comms, and Thorne heard her raw, unfiltered panic. "Chief, do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. The energy mass I just recorded. If he wanted to break the planet in half, he already would have. Hold your fire. Hold everyone's fire." Master Chief didn't flinch. The towering green giant stood his ground amidst the wreckage. He didn't take a step backward, but in a deliberate, highly calculated display of military de-escalation, he slowly lowered the barrel of his MA-5B assault rifle toward the dirt. It was a universal sign of caution, a warrior acknowledging a force he could not overcome with bullets. Jin-Woo stopped 2 paces away from the Spartan. He tilted his head, his glowing blue eyes analyzing the battered, scorched, and blood-stained armor. Even through the polarized gold visor, Jin-Woo could feel the immense, crushing weight of the soul inside the machine. It was a soul forged in agony, driven by a relentless, self-sacrificing duty to shield a fragile species from the dark. It felt incredibly familiar. The corner of Jin-Woo's mouth twitched upward in a small, melancholic smile. It seems that no matter the universe, humanity is always standing on the edge of the abyss. Jin-Woo's voice was calm, a deep, resonant baritone that carried no threat, only an ancient weariness. "You fight hard, soldier." Master Chief remained silent for a long, heavy second. The gears in his mind, enhanced by Spartan augmentations, processed the impossible variables. Finally, the chief gave a slow, deliberate nod. His voice, artificially deepened by his helmet speakers, rumbled across the ash. "Your intervention saved this sector. Humanity owes you a debt, but the Covenant fleet is still in orbit. The war for our survival isn't over." "Then keep moving forward," Jin-Woo replied softly. He turned away from the Spartan, facing the empty air. He raised his hand, and the fabric of reality began to tear once more, revealing the freezing, abyssal gateway of his portal. "As long as you stand your ground against the dark, it will never truly consume you." Jin-Woo stepped toward the void, intending to leave this burning universe behind. But as his boot hovered over the threshold of the portal, the ambient light on the ash plains violently shifted. The heavy orange sky suddenly flashed a blinding, radioactive white. Corporal Thorne looked up, his blood turning to ice. The Covenant armada in the upper atmosphere had stopped their scattered bombardment. High above, tearing through the cloud cover, the sleek, monstrous underbelly of a Covenant supercarrier became visible. It was kilometers long, an engine of absolute genocide, and its ventral plasma cannons were glowing with the intensity of a dying star. They weren't targeting the human cities anymore. Every single ship in the armada had detected the catastrophic spike of dark energy, and the religious zealots had reached a terrifying conclusion. They were going to glass the entire continent just to burn the anomaly out of existence. The portal in front of Jin-Woo violently destabilized, flickering and collapsing as the sheer mass of the descending supercarrier warped the local gravity well. Jin-Woo slowly lowered his foot back onto the ash. The melancholic smile faded from his lips, replaced by a cold, terrifying scowl. He looked up at the blinding white sky. Thorne slumped into the mud, his hands trembling violently. The silence of the dead had been shattered by a greater apocalypse. His worldview was permanently fractured. The comforting, tragic certainty of losing a conventional war to the Covenant was gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that the universe was filled with gods, shadows, and cosmic horrors that defied human comprehension. Death was no longer a release. It was just a doorway to a new, colder servitude. The supercarrier's cannons reached critical mass, a hum that shook the fluid in Thorne's inner ear. The Covenant had forced the Emperor's hand. He couldn't leave. The true war for Planet Reach was only just beginning, and Thorne knew with absolute certainty that no matter who won, the ash plains would never see the light of day again. The shadow of the Covenant supercarrier fell across the ash plains like a physical weight, eclipsing the burning orange sky and plunging the battlefield into an artificial twilight. Corporal Elias Thorne lay paralyzed in the mud, his eyes fixed upward as the colossal manta-ray-shaped dreadnought descended through the upper atmosphere. It was over 3 kilometers of impenetrable purple alloy, a flying city dedicated to the singular religious purpose of holy genocide. The sheer mass of the vessel displaced the air with a low, continuous rumble that rattled the loose teeth in Thorne's skull. Along its smooth, armored underbelly, a series of enormous circular apertures began to dilate. Within them, a sickeningly bright, white-hot energy was pooling, coalescing into swirling vortexes of superheated plasma. It was the ship's ventral glassing beam, a weapon designed to boil oceans, melt continents, and turn the surface of entire planets into smooth, radioactive glass. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that Thorne's ears popped painfully, and all the hair on his arms stood on end from the massive buildup of static electricity. He tasted blood and copper in his mouth. They weren't just going to kill the anomaly, they were going to erase the very geography he stood upon. Thorne squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his face into the dirt, waiting for the localized extinction event. The audio sensors in his helmet automatically dampened, emitting a high-pitched whine as they tried to protect his eardrums from the impending sonic catastrophe. A blinding flash, brighter than a localized supernova, penetrated his closed eyelids, turning his vision entirely white. The glassing beam fired. It was not a single projectile, but a continuous roaring pillar of absolute destruction, miles wide, plummeting from the heavens with the wrath of an angry god. The sheer ambient heat radiating from the descending beam instantly flash-boiled the moisture in the air, turning the lingering smoke and ash into a suffocating cloud of superheated steam. Thorne felt the composite armor of his UNSC plating grow painfully hot against his skin. This was the end. The absolute, inescapable mathematics of Covenant orbital supremacy. No localized spatial distortion, no army of the dead could stop a beam of concentrated starfire designed to crack a planet's crust. But the apocalyptic impact never reached the dirt. A sound like tearing canvas, magnified 1,000,000 times over, ripped through the air, violently clashing with the deafening roar of the descending plasma. Thorne dared to open his eyes, squinting through the blinding glare. Directly above them, a dome of pitch-black, absolute darkness had erupted from the ground. It was an inverted hemisphere of swirling, liquid shadow, expanding with terrifying speed to blanket the immediate airspace above the surviving Marines and the Master Chief. The blinding pillar of white-hot plasma slammed into the apex of the Shadow Dome. The resulting collision defied all known laws of physics. The energy did not splash outward, nor did the shield shatter. Instead, the blinding light of the Covenant weapon ground against the impenetrable darkness, shrieking like metal caught in an industrial grinder. The sky split into 2 violent halves, a heaven of blinding radioactive fire and a localized hell of freezing, suffocating shadow. Underneath the dome, the temperature plummeted back to a bone-chilling cold. The deafening roar of the glassing beam was muffled into a distant, heavy vibration. Thorne looked toward the center of the anomaly. Jin-Woo stood completely still, his right hand raised toward the heavens, his fingers slightly curved, as if physically holding up the sky. His glowing blue eyes were narrowed, not in exertion, but in deep, simmering irritation. The dark aura radiating from his body was so dense it looked like black flames licking the edges of his trench coat. Beside him, Master Chief had planted his heavy boots deep into the soil, his massive frame shielding 2 wounded Marines from the localized kinetic shockwaves echoing off the dome's interior. Over the scrambled tactical frequency, Cortana's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with digital awe. "Chief, the thermal output of that beam is exceeding 90,000 degrees Kelvin. It should be melting the bedrock beneath us just from proximity, but the energy, it's being negated. He's not reflecting it. He's actively starving the plasma of its kinetic state." The young man in the black coat slowly lowered his hand, though the massive shadow dome remained firmly in place, continuously grinding against the planetary bombardment. Jin-Woo tilted his head up, his gaze piercing through the swirling black barrier to the colossal silhouette of the supercarrier above. A low, vibrating hum began to resonate from his chest, a sound that bypassed human hearing and struck directly at the nervous system. The shadow at his feet began to bubble and churn, expanding violently outward until it swallowed the entire blast crater. From the depths of that abyssal pool, a new horror began to manifest. It was not a humanoid soldier. It was something pulled from the darkest pages of forgotten human mythology. A massive skeletal wing pierced the surface of the darkness, followed by a second. The air rushed inward as a colossal wyvern, composed entirely of jagged obsidian bone and freezing blue fire, hauled its massive frame onto the physical plane. Kaisel threw its long, serrated neck back and unleashed a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the visors of the fallen Marines. Corporal Thorne clamped his hands over his helmet, his mind actively fracturing at the sight. The UNSC had trained him to fight aliens with advanced technology, religious zealots with plasma rifles and energy shields. But looking at the massive, undead dragon stretching its wings across the battlefield, Thorne realized he was witnessing the violent collision of 2 entirely different realities. The sci-fi warfare of the 26th century had just been violently hijacked by ancient primordial magic. The sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing a fantasy monster preparing to assault a 3-kilometer-long spaceship made Thorne feel violently ill. His previous belief that humanity was the tragic victim of a superior alien race was entirely gone. They were dust mites. They were insignificant bacteria caught in the crossfire between an empire of zealots and a solitary walking god of death. The universe wasn't just cold and indifferent. It was actively terrifying, populated by entities that treated the laws of thermodynamics as mere suggestions. As Jin-Woo released a concentrated burst of his magical aura, like a bullet fired from a railgun, Kaisel launched directly upward. The sheer kinetic force of their takeoff created a localized vacuum, lifting loose rocks, shattered armor, and Covenant corpses into the air before slamming them back down. The wyvern tore through the apex of the protective shadow dome, plunging directly into the heart of the roaring glassing beam. Thorne expected the creature to instantly vaporize. Instead, the shadow wyvern acted like an armored torpedo, swimming up the current of superheated plasma. The intense, blinding light of the Covenant weapon simply washed over Kaisel's dark scales, unable to penetrate the absolute zero of its magical composition. They were flying straight up the barrel of the gun. On board the Covenant supercarrier, panic, pure and unfiltered, ripped through the bridge. The shipmaster, an ancient elite scarred by decades of successful planetary conquests, stared at the holographic sensors in absolute disbelief. The target was not dead. Worse, the target was ascending the main firing column at a speed that defied the gravitational pull of the planet. The ship's AI screamed warnings in its harsh, clicking language. Frantic orders were barked. The glassing beam was abruptly severed, plunging the sky back into a chaotic twilight. Dozens of anti-aircraft point defense turrets along the vessel's ventral hull tracked the incoming anomaly. Thousands of high-velocity plasma torpedoes painted the sky green and blue, converging on the massive Shadow Wyvern. But it was entirely futile. Kaisel banked and rolled with impossible agility, dodging the heaviest fire while the smaller plasma bolts simply absorbed into the Wyvern's dark aura, like raindrops hitting an ocean. They reached the hull of the supercarrier. To a human observer, breaching a vessel of that magnitude required specialized orbital drop pods, magnetic explosive charges, and coordinated infiltration teams. Jin-Woo didn't bother with tactics. He simply stood on the back of his mount and unsheathed 2 daggers that glowed with a sickly, poisonous green light. He swung his arms in an intricate, blindingly fast crisscross pattern. From the blades, massive arcs of pure dark energy erupted, hundreds of feet long. The energy blades carved into the impenetrable purple alloy of the supercarrier as if it were made of wet clay. The deafening, agonizing shriek of tearing metal echoed across the continent. Thousands of tons of heavily armored hull plating sheared away, exposing the glowing, pulsing internal corridors of the ship to the vacuum of the upper atmosphere. Secondary explosions rippled across the vessel's underbelly as localized power conduits ruptured, raining molten metal down onto the ash plains like deadly meteors. From his vantage point on the ground, Thorne watched the impossible unfold. The kilometer-long warship shuddered violently. Then the shadows began to pour inside. Jin-Woo didn't even enter the breach. He hovered outside on Ames's Wyvern, his glowing eyes locked on the terrified crew, visible through the massive gash in the hull. He simply raised his hand, and the tide of darkness that had previously slaughtered the ground forces surged upward. Thousands of shadow soldiers, led by the shrieking insectoid king, Beru, and the stoic, bloody knight Igris, flooded into the corridors of the supercarrier. Over the local tactical comms, Cortana managed to decrypt the Covenant's internal communication frequencies. She immediately broadcast the audio feed to Master Chief's squad, a brutal, unvarnished stream of raw data. The channel was a chaotic chorus of alien screams, the frantic clicking of mandibles, the visceral sound of tearing flesh, and the wet, heavy thud of severed limbs hitting the deck. The elite zealots were begging their gods for mercy. The brutes were roaring in helpless terror. Thorne listened to the audio feed, his stomach violently rejecting its contents. He leaned over in the mud and dry-heaved. The sound of the slaughter was intimate, horrifying, and incredibly efficient. This wasn't a battle for control of the ship. It was an extermination protocol moving at the speed of thought. The shadows felt no exhaustion, no pity, and no fear. They were dismantling the crew of the dreadnought compartment by compartment, using their own severed limbs and weapons against them. Master Chief abruptly severed the audio feed, sparing the young corporal's sanity. The Spartan looked up at the dying behemoth in the sky. He understood the tactical reality of what was happening. The young man in the black coat wasn't just destroying a ship. He was sending a message. He was systematically breaking the psychological foundation of the Covenant Empire. He was showing them what it meant to truly be hunted. Deep within the bowels of the supercarrier, the shadow forces breached the main engineering bay. The massive, pulsing anti-gravity engines that kept the 3-kilometer ship suspended in the atmosphere were targeted. With a single devastating strike from his greatsword, Igris shattered the central containment core. The catastrophic loss of power was instantaneous. The low, rumbling hum that had terrorized the ash plains abruptly died. On the outside, the massive, glowing purple thrusters flickered and faded to black. The sheer gravitational pull of Planet Reach immediately asserted its dominance over the millions of tons of dead metal. The supercarrier began to list heavily to its starboard side, its nose dipping toward the horizon. The sky shrieked as the massive vessel began its terminal descent, dragging a tail of thick black smoke and burning plasma behind it. It was falling, A city-sized sledgehammer was dropping from the heavens. "Brace for impact," Master Chief roared, his artificially enhanced voice cutting through the rising panic. He didn't order them to run. There was nowhere to go. A vessel of that size crashing into the crust of the planet would create a seismic event equivalent to a massive asteroid strike. The Spartan grabbed Thorne by the armor harness, physically hauling the terrified corporal down to the deepest part of the crater, throwing his massive shielded body over the human soldier to protect him from the incoming shockwave. Jin-Woo, still hovering high above on Kaisel, watched the dying dreadnought plummet toward the distant mountain range. He didn't attempt to stop it or alter its course. He had neutralized the threat to his immediate airspace, and the collateral damage to the planet's topography was irrelevant to him. The Monarch's priority was absolute victory, not environmental preservation. The supercarrier struck the horizon. For 3 excruciating seconds there was absolute silence as the light of the impact reached them before the sound. The distant mountain range simply evaporated into a blinding dome of orange and white fire. Then the shockwave hit. It was a solid wall of displaced air, dust, and kinetic force moving at supersonic speeds. It slammed into the ash plains, tearing the topsoil away, uprooting the burning remain of Scorpion tanks, and instantly vaporizing the bodies of the dead Covenant soldiers left outside the immediate blast crater. Thorne felt his eardrums rupture, a sharp, piercing pain followed by a warm trickle of blood down his neck. The ground bucked violently beneath them, throwing the massive Spartan into the air before slamming them both back into the dirt. The sky was entirely blotted out by an ocean of pulverized rock and ash. From under the heavy arm of the Master, from under the heavy arm of the Master Chief, he looked out over the lip of the crater. The geography of the ash plains had been permanently, violently altered. The distant mountains were gone, replaced by a glowing, molten crater that stretched for miles. The human corporal was hollowed out. His terror of the Covenant had been completely overwritten by a paralyzing dread of the entity hovering above them. He realized that survival on this battlefield meant witnessing horrors that would permanently scar his soul. But as he looked up into the suffocating cloud of ash, he saw the faint, terrifying blue glow of the Emperor's eyes. The destruction of the supercarrier wasn't the end. High above in the ionosphere, the remaining hundreds of ships in the Covenant armada were breaking formation. They had just watched a god swat their mightiest vessel out of the sky. They were no longer trying to conquer Planet Reach. They were preparing to deploy their entire combined arsenal to crack the planet in half, ensuring the anomaly could never leave. The true escalation, the impossible moral choice, was rapidly approaching, and the cost of survival was about to become unbearable. The pulverized remains of the ash plains fell from the sky like a gray, suffocating snowstorm. The immediate aftermath of the supercarrier's catastrophic impact was not an explosion of sound, but a heavy, localized vacuum that sucked the very breath from Corporal Elias Thorne's lungs. He lay flat against the trembling bedrock, his face pressed into the dirt, feeling the warm, sticky fluid leaking from his ruptured eardrums down the side of his neck. The world had gone entirely agonizingly deaf. The only audio he could process was the high-pitched metallic ringing inside his own skull, a phantom frequency born from extreme acoustic trauma. He slowly pushed himself upward, his armored gauntlets sinking into soil that was now baked into a brittle ceramic crust. The geography of the battlefield had been fundamentally unmade. The towering mountain range on the northern horizon, a geographical landmark that had stood for millions of years, was simply gone. In its place was a jagged, glowing lake of molten rock and bubbling magma, illuminating the choking dust clouds with an angry, subterranean crimson light. As the thick, displaced atmosphere slowly began to settle, the true horror of their situation revealed itself in the heavens. The violent atmospheric displacement caused by the crashed dreadnought had violently blown away the heavy orange cloud cover that usually choked the skies of Reach. For the first time since the invasion began, Thorne could see the stars, but they were not stars. They were the synchronized, overlapping silhouettes of the remaining Covenant armada. Hundreds of capital ships, sleek, predatory assault carriers, heavily armored cruisers, and dagger-shaped destroyers were shifting out of their scattered orbital holding patterns. They moved with a chilling mathematical precision, abandoning their individual landing zones and troop deployments. Driven by absolute religious terror, the alien fleet was assembling into a perfect interlocking grid of overlapping firing arcs. The sky was no longer a canopy of air, it was a solid ceiling of impenetrable purple alloy, bristling with thousands of heavy plasma batteries that were all rotating to point directly down at the planetary crust. Inside the localized comms network of Master Chief's helmet, the digital presence of Cortana was flashing with frantic, hyper-accelerated warning codes. The artificial intelligence had bypassed Thorne's damaged external audio receivers, broadcasting her urgent tactical breakdown directly through his armor's bone conduction speakers. Her voice felt like it was vibrating inside his jaw, stripping away any lingering delusions of survival. Chief, the Covenant fleet is abandoning all planetary occupation protocols. They are executing a synchronized, theater-wide orbital realignment. I am tracking 312 capital-class energy signatures spooling to maximum thermal output. They aren't trying to glass our immediate grid anymore. They are locking their targeting arrays onto the planet's major tectonic fault lines. Cortana's voice hitched, a digital simulation of profound human dread. They're going to crack the mantle. They are going to shatter Reach into an asteroid belt just to ensure the anomaly cannot escape. Jin-Woo descended from the boiling sky. The massive skeletal wyvern, Kaisel, dissolved into a torrent of black mist before its talons even touched the scorched earth. The Monarch of Shadows landed softly, his black boots making no sound against the brittle crust. He did not look at the glowing crater where he had buried the supercarrier. His glowing, ethereal blue eyes were locked entirely on the orbital grid assembling above. The ambient pressure radiating from his body had shifted. The cold, detached curiosity that had defined his arrival was gone, replaced by a dense, suffocating aura of absolute simmering fury. The air around him distorted, visibly warping the light as his immense magical presence clashed violently with the rising thermal radiation of the alien fleet. He could feel the incredible synchronized buildup of destructive energy in the exosphere. It was a cowardly tactic, a pathetic retreat to the safety of the void, hiding behind the impenetrable barrier of space where ground-based infantry, no matter how immortal, could not reach them. Master Chief rose from his defensive crouch, the thick, heavy plates of his Mjolnir armor scarred and coated in a thick layer of white ash. The Spartan towered over the human marines, a walking tank of green titanium, yet he moved with calculated, deliberate caution as he approached the Monarch. "They won't come down here to fight you," the Chief's voice rumbled through the bone conduction channel, heavy and perfectly composed despite the apocalyptic variables. "The Covenant operates on absolute religious dogma. To them, you aren't just an enemy combatant. You are a heresy that actively defies the natural order of their gods. Their protocol for a localized demonic manifestation is absolute containment through self-immolation. They will gladly burn this entire hemisphere, along with millions of their own ground troops, if it guarantees you are erased from existence." The Spartan racked the charging handle of his assault rifle, a purely reflexive action, as bullets were utterly useless against the void of space. "If we don't break their firing sequence in the next 4 minutes, the crust beneath our feet will liquefy." Jin-Woo did not blink. His gaze remained fixed on the glowing underbellies of the alien warships. He understood the tactical disadvantage perfectly. His shadow army was vast, a seemingly infinite tide of immortal soldiers capable of dismantling any ground force in the universe, but they were bound by the physical limitations of the space they occupied. While his elite commanders like Beru and Igris could fly, traversing the immense freezing vacuum of space to systematically dismantle over 300 heavily shielded capital ships before they fired was mathematically impossible. Gravity and time were the only enemies that still held power over him. They believe distance guarantees their safety. Jin-Woo finally spoke, his deep baritone voice vibrating with a chilling, metallic edge that resonated in the hollow space of Thorne's chest. They believe that the cold vacuum of space is a shield I cannot shatter. They are about to learn that the shadow of death does not require an atmosphere to breathe. Before the monarch could initiate his next command, the sky violently tore open. It was not a tear in reality, but a localized fracture in the atmosphere caused by a warning shot. Far away, beyond the curvature of the horizon, the lead Covenant assault carrier fired a single, concentrated pulse from its primary ventral beam. The target was not the ash plains. It was the densely populated coastal megacity of New Alexandria, located over 2,000 miles away on the continent of Eridanus. The beam struck the earth with the wrath of a dying star. First, from their vantage point, Thorne and the Master Chief did not see the city burn. They saw the entire western horizon instantly flash into a blinding, radioactive white. The ambient light of the world shifted entirely, painting the ash-choked plains in a sickly, fluorescent glare. Millions of human lives, military personnel and civilians alike, were instantly vaporized in a microsecond of unimaginable thermal violence. The planet itself screamed in agony. The physical consequences of the distant strike took a full minute to reach them. When it did, the very bedrock of reach violently buckled. A massive, rolling seismic shockwave tore through the continent, traveling through the subterranean plates and ripping the earth apart. Deep, jagged fissures exploded across the ash plains, swallowing the burning wreckage of UNSC tanks and Covenant dropships into the dark, crushing depths of the earth. Corporal Thorne was thrown off his feet, his shoulder violently slamming against the side of a newly formed chasm. He scrambled desperately in the dirt, digging his armored fingers into the crumbling soil to keep from sliding into the abyss. He vomited violently into his helmet, a visceral, uncontrollable reaction to the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the destruction. The war he had trained for, a war of trenches, rifles, and tactical maneuvers, was a pathetic illusion. He was an ant watching deities hurl localized suns at each other. Thorne looked up through the violently shaking earth, his eyes fixed on the monarch of shadows. He expected the young man to show panic, to summon his portal and abandon this doomed, cracking world to its fiery fate. Instead, Jin-Woo simply stood over a widening fissure, his coat billowing violently in the artificially generated hurricane winds. The destruction of the distant human city had not elicited fear. It had triggered something far darker. The monarch's glowing blue eyes flared with a blinding, terrifying intensity. The air temperature, already brutally cold, plummeted to absolute zero. The moisture in the air instantly froze, falling to the ground as heavy, jagged shards of black ice. Jin-Woo slowly raised both of his arms, his palms facing the glowing, ruined horizon. "You wish to weaponize the heavens against the earth?" Jin-Woo's voice echoed, no longer constrained by vocal cords, but broadcasting directly into the minds of every living creature on the continent. "Then I will weaponize the grave against the stars." The ground beneath the ash plains erupted. The single, elongated shadow cast by Jin-Woo's boots did not just expand. It exploded outward like a tidal wave of heavy, viscous ink, flooding the entire battlefield and pouring directly into the massive, gaping fissures torn open by the seismic shock. The monarch was completely unsealing his mana, draining the vast, unfathomable reserves of his magical core. The darkness surged across the blasted landscape, moving with terrifying purpose toward the glowing molten crater where the Covenant supercarrier had crashed. The shadows violently flooded the 3-kilometer-long wreckage of the alien dreadnought. They did not just coat the metal, they seeped into the cracked armor plating, bleeding into the ruptured plasma conduits, and actively fusing with the shattered, dead technology of the Covenant. It was a horrific, unprecedented synthesis of hyper-advanced alien engineering and ancient, primordial necromancy. Cortana's digital voice shrieked through the comms, stripped of all military decorum. "Chief, the energy readings, they are impossible. The core temperature of the crashed supercarrier is rapidly dropping. The internal gravity drives, the primary plasma conduits, the slip space rupture engines, they are being forcibly reignited. But it's not plasma flowing through the ship's veins. It's pure, condensed dark matter. He is entirely overriding the vessel's operating system with his own biological energy signature. He isn't just reviving the dead flesh of the Covenant. He is resurrecting the dead machinery of their armada." The ground violently shook again, not from a distant impact, but from a localized earthquake originating from the molten crater. With a deafening metallic shriek that tore at the very fabric of reality, the ruined 3-kilometer husk of the Covenant supercarrier began to rise from its fiery grave. The massive vessel was a terrifying abomination to behold. Its smooth purple alloy was now entirely coated in jagged, freezing black ice. The massive rents in its armor were stitched together by pulsing, thick veins of glowing blue shadow magic. It hovered over the crater, suspended by a gravity drive powered purely by the Monarch's will. Jin-Woo did not summon his army to board the ship. He was the ship. Thousands of shadow soldiers, permanently bonded to the metal, manned every ruptured turret, every severed conduit, and every destroyed command console. The dead dreadnought rotated its massive, shattered bow upward, pointing directly at the heart of the synchronized Covenant fleet hovering in the upper exosphere. The Monarch of Shadows had forged his own anti-orbital weapon from the bones of his enemy. The Covenant armada in orbit immediately detected the massive, impossible energy spike radiating from the surface. The religious fanaticism of the alien commanders overrode any lingering tactical hesitation. The entire grid of over 300 capital ships flashed blindingly white. They were locking their primary glassing beams, not on the fault lines, but directly on the resurrected ghost ship and the anomaly standing before it. The countdown to absolute planetary annihilation was measured in seconds. The sky began to boil as the collective thermal output of the fleet began its terminal descent. The heavens were falling, an inescapable curtain of radioactive fire designed to burn the ash plains down to the planetary core. Corporal Elias Thorne stared at the descending wall of fire, his mind finally permanently snapping. The paralyzing terror had burned itself out, leaving only a hollow, vibrating numbness. He had lost his hearing, his squad, and the entire continent of Eridanus. The comforting illusion that humanity was the master of its own destiny had been violently incinerated. As he watched the lone, dark god raise a resurrected spaceship to combat an alien sun, Thorne realized that survival on Planet Reach no longer depended on human courage or UNSC technology. They were completely, pathetically reliant on a monster who wore the face of a man. The glassing beam was dropping. The ghost ship was charging its dark retaliation. Act 5 of the Extinction Protocol was unavoidable, and Thorne knew that whatever explosive, reality-breaking collision happened next, the collateral damage would demand a price in human souls that could never be repaid. The sky above Planet Reach did not simply burn, it violently collapsed. 312 capital-class plasma beams, each capable of boiling a localized ocean, merged in the upper exosphere. They formed a singular, apocalyptic pillar of white-hot eradication that defied the very concept of scale. It was a solid wall of descending starfire, stretching across the entire visible horizon, a curtain of absolute thermodynamic violence dropping at the speed of light. The ambient atmosphere of the ash plains instantly ignited. The oxygen itself caught fire, transforming the air into a suffocating, superheated plasma storm. Corporal Elias Thorne lay pinned to the trembling bedrock, his ruptured eardrums sparing him the planet-shattering roar, but his nervous system was screaming. The composite titanium plating of his UNSC armor, designed to withstand the vacuum of space and the extreme heat of atmospheric re-entry, began to actively fail. Warning runes flashed across his cracked visor in a frantic, blinding red sequence. His internal suit temperature spiked past 150 degrees. His sweat flash-boiled against his skin, raising agonizing blisters across his arms and chest. He was being cooked alive inside his own protective shell, a microscopic speck of organic matter caught beneath the descending boot of an angry, mechanical god. Beneath the towering, jagged hemisphere of the Monarch's Shadow Dome, the Master Chief stood perfectly rigid. The Spartan's heavily shielded bulk was the only thing preventing the sheer, kinetic pressure of the incoming fire from crushing Thorne into paste. But even the legendary Mjolnir armor was smoking, the localized energy shields flaring a desperate dying gold as the ambient thermal radiation bled through the absolute zero of the magical barrier. Inside the localized tactical network, Cortana's digital voice was completely devoid of its usual calm, analytical cadence. She was practically shouting, her synthesized vocal cords fraying under the weight of impossible data. "Chief, the combined thermal mass of the Covenant grid is exceeding his displacement capacity. He is holding the line directly above us, but the oversplash is violently spreading. The atmospheric friction alone is going to ignite the Vihar transit corridor in less than 90 seconds. There are over 80,000 human refugees trapped in the subterranean highway beneath Sector 7. If the outer edges of that plasma curtain touch the ground, the bedrock will superheat and bake them alive in their own bunkers." Jin-Woo stood at the epicenter of the crater, his boots planted on the frozen, glassy earth. He was not looking at the descending wall of fire, nor was he looking at the colossal, undead supercarrier hovering silently behind him. His glowing blue eyes were entirely unfocused, staring into a dimension of pure, abstract mathematics. The Monarch of Shadows was calculating the finite limits of his own immortality. His mana pool was vast, an ocean of dark energy harvested from 1,000 conquered worlds, but it was not infinite. Projecting an impenetrable shadow shield across an entire hemisphere to protect the scattered human refugee columns required a constant, agonizing hemorrhage of magical energy. Simultaneously, reanimating and powering a 3-kilometer-long alien warship to fire a concentrated beam of dark matter required an entirely separate, massive reservoir of power. The universe demanded a toll for altering its physical laws so violently. Jin-Woo realized, with the cold, absolute clarity of a general who had fought 1,000,000 wars, that he could not perform both miracles simultaneously. He could hold the defensive shield and delay the inevitable, slowly bleeding out his mana until the Covenant eventually cracked the planet. Or he could strike the heavens down, but to strike, he needed to consolidate his power. "Retract." He turned his head, his glowing retract. He turned his head, his glowing blue eyes locking onto the gold visor of the Master Chief. When Jin-Woo spoke, his voice did not echo through the air. It bypassed the ruined atmosphere entirely and resonated directly within the skulls of the Spartan and the young corporal. "Your enemies are cowards, hiding behind the curvature of the world." The Monarch's voice was devoid of malice, carrying only the terrifying, sterile weight of absolute pragmatism. "To reach them, to break their fleet and sever their fire, I must weaponize the very gravity of this world. I must feed the dreadnought. But my power is currently stretched thin acting as a blanket over your scattered people. I cannot hold the shield over the distant valleys and fire the lance simultaneously. The mathematics of survival demand a consolidation. I must retract the outer barriers. Master Chief's assault rifle dropped slightly, a rare, almost imperceptible falter in the Spartan's flawless discipline. The tactical implication slammed into his augmented brain with the force of a physical blow. Cortana projected the planetary map onto the Chief's HUD, the holographic display bleeding over into Thorne's linked visor. Across the burning continent, massive swaths of territory were painted in bright, pulsing green, the locations of human refugee convoys, makeshift field hospitals, and subterranean civilian bunkers. They were currently protected by thin, invisible layers of Jin-Woo's shadow magic, holding back the apocalyptic heat of the Covenant bombardment. If those green zones lost their localized shielding, they would be instantly exposed to the thermal oversplash of 300 glassing beams. No. The Master Chief's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, a sound that carried decades of unyielding moral conviction. There are 80,000 non-combatants in the Vihar corridor alone. We do not trade civilian lives for tactical advantage. You will hold that shield. We will find another way. Jin-Woo looked at the towering green soldier. There was a flicker of genuine respect in the monarch's eyes, a sad acknowledgement of the Spartan's pure, unbreakable spirit. But respect did not alter reality. There is no other way, Spartan, Jin-Woo replied, his tone chillingly gentle. If I do not strike now, this entire planet will shatter, and all of them will die regardless, along with the rest of your species. I am not a savior who preserves every blade of grass. I am the king of the dead. I deal in the currency of ultimate outcomes. To save the billions, the thousands must be surrendered to the fire. The young man in the black coat did not wait for permission. He did not ask for absolution. He simply closed his eyes and inhaled a sharp, deep breath. He severed the magical tethers connecting him to the distant territories. On Thorne's cracked visor, the tactical map updated with horrifying, merciless speed. The massive green zones covering the distant refugee corridors flickered, distorted, and instantly turned a violently glaring red. The shadow barriers had been dropped. The audio feed, previously deadened by Thorne's ruptured eardrums, was suddenly flooded by an emergency override from Cortana. It was not data. It was raw, unfiltered human suffering. The encrypted civilian channels erupted into a chaotic, agonizing symphony of screams. Thorne heard the frantic voices of convoy drivers, the terrified sobbing of children, and the desperate, futile prayers of medics. Then the audio spiked into a burst of pure, static violence as the thermal wave hit the ground. The subterranean bunkers flash-boiled. The transport vehicles melted into slag. 80,000 human lives, men, women, and children who believed they had survived the worst of the invasion, were instantly, brutally incinerated. They were wiped from the face of the universe in a fraction of a second. The audio channels went dead, leaving only the cold, sterile hiss of empty static. Master Chief lunged. It was an instinctual, explosive movement, driven by a profound, agonizing rage. The Spartan, a man who had sacrificed his entire humanity to protect his species, threw his massive armored bulk toward the monarch of shadows, his fists raised to strike down the entity that had just callously murdered his people. But he never reached his target. Jin-Woo did not even raise a hand. A wall of pure, localized gravity slammed into the Master Chief, a pressure so immense and localized that it forced the half-ton Spartan to his knees. The titanium plating of the Mjolnir armor groaned in protest, micro-fractures spiderwebbing across the surface. Thorne watched, paralyzed by horror and physical weakness, as the invincible savior of humanity was effortlessly pinned to the dirt like an unruly child. "Do not let their sacrifice be cheapened by your anger," Jin-Woo commanded. his eyes blazing with a terrifying, absolute authority. Watch the sky, Spartan. Watch what their lives have bought. The energy retracted from the slaughtered civilians flooded into the crater. It was a visible, horrifying phenomenon. Torrents of pure black magic, thick and heavy as crude oil, rushed across the ash plains and funneled directly into the ruined hull of the resurrected supercarrier. The massive undead dreadnought shuddered violently, its frozen, icy exterior cracking to reveal pulsing veins of dark purple light. The thousands of shadow soldiers fused to its internal circuitry roared in unison, a sound that shook the very bedrock of the continent. The dreadnought's main ventral cannon, the very weapon that had tried to glass the anomaly moments ago, was forcibly reconfigured. Instead of drawing power from a plasma reactor, it was drawing from the concentrated infinite well of the Monarch's rage and the newly freed mana pool. A sphere of absolute light-devouring blackness began to form at the mouth of the cannon. It was not a laser, it was a localized singularity, a tear in the fabric of the universe itself. An incalculable speed. It was a pillar of an incalculable speed. It was a pillar of pure, screaming void that pierced the descending wall of Covenant plasma as easily as a needle passing through wet tissue paper. The thermal energy of the alien fleet was not deflected. It was instantly consumed, absorbed into the vacuum of the shadow beam. Thorne stared upward, his breath catching in his throat. The blinding white sky was violently split in half by a rising column of absolute night. The beam tore right through the atmosphere, exiting the exosphere and violently impacting the dead center of the synchronized Covenant armada. There was no explosion. There was no fiery detonation. In the cold vacuum of space, the impact of the Monarch's wrath manifested as a horrifying, silent necrosis. The dark matter beam struck the lead assault carrier, and the massive purple warship simply ceased to exist. The energy did not stop there. It spread outward like a hyper-accelerated plague, leaping from hull to hull across the tight, interlocking grid of the alien fleet. The impenetrable energy shields of the Covenant vessels short-circuited instantly. The advanced titanium alloys rusted, decayed, and dissolved into gray dust in a matter of seconds. Within the span of a single heartbeat, the majestic, terrifying armada that had sought to conquer the stars was entirely consumed by the creeping, unnatural shadow. 300 capital ships carrying millions of elite alien warriors were unmade. The sky above Reach, previously choked with plasma and terror, was suddenly, violently clear. The stars shone brightly against the black void of space, undisturbed by the massive floating graveyard of dust that was all that remained of the Holy Fleet. Silence descended upon the ash plains, heavier and more oppressive than the roar of the bombardment. The undead supercarrier, its purpose fulfilled and its stolen energy expended, slowly sank back into the molten crater, its shadow-infused frame dissolving into black mist until nothing remained but scorched earth. The Monarch of Shadows stood quietly, his breathing steady, his terrifying aura slowly receding back into his mortal shell. The localized gravity pinning the Master Chief dissolved. The Spartan rose slowly to his feet, his armor battered, his head bowed. He did not raise his weapon. He simply stood there, staring at the empty sky, the weight of the 80,000 murdered souls pressing down on his broad, armored shoulders. The Covenant was gone. The immediate threat of planetary extinction had been violently erased. Reach had been saved. But the victory was coated in a thick, suffocating layer of moral rot. But it was not the ash of the Covenant. It was a light, gray snow. But it was not the ash of the Covenant. It was not the pulverized rock of the mountains. It was the organic fallout, the microscopic, charred remnants of the human refugee columns that had been sacrificed miles away, carried on the artificial wind. Thorne felt the soft, gray flakes land on his cracked visor. He was alive. He would go home. He would be hailed as a survivor of the greatest battle in human history, but his mind was irrevocably shattered. His previous belief that survival was inherently good, that living to fight another day was the ultimate victory, was gone. He had witnessed a god slaughter his own flock to kill a wolf. As Thorne stared at the back of the young man in the black coat, he understood the true permanent cost of the miraculous. They were no longer the protagonists of their own universe. They were just acceptable casualties in a war of monsters, and some stains, no matter how bright the victory, would never wash away. The gray snow continued to fall across the shattered expanse of the ash plains, a soft, horrific precipitation that mocked the violent reality of the battlefield. Corporal Elias Thorne remained on his knees in the cooling dirt. He slowly removed his cracked helmet, the pressurized seals hissing as the compromised atmosphere of Planet Reach filled his lungs. The air tasted of ozone, burning plasma, and something fundamentally organic. He reached out with a trembling armored hand, letting the falling gray flakes accumulate on his gauntlet. It was not the radioactive fallout from the obliterated Covenant armada in the exosphere. It was not the pulverized ceramic dust of the surrounding mountain ranges. It was the biological ash of 80,000 human beings, carried miles across the continent on the artificial violent winds generated by the Monarch's collapsed shadow shield. The silence that gripped the battlefield was absolute, a crushing, suffocating void that felt infinitely heavier than the roaring plasma bombardments that had previously threatened to shatter his sanity. Thorne's internal transformation, the violent and irreversible death of his naive military idealism, crystallized in the freezing air. He had prayed to the heavens for a miracle to save his life, and the universe had answered by coldly trading the lives of distant families, children, and medics to balance the equation of survival. The heavy titanium composite plates of his UNSC armor suddenly felt like a perfectly tailored coffin. Thorne wasn't a survivor of a grand, heroic defense. He was merely a ghost, permitted to keep breathing only because a walking god of death had deemed his specific grid coordinate tactically advantageous to the slaughter. Beside him, the towering silhouette of the Master Chief remained perfectly still, a monolithic statue of green armor staring out into the settling dust. But the stillness of the Spartan was not peaceful. It was the terrifying, compressed kinetic energy of a nuclear warhead seconds before detonation. The chief did not raise his MA-5B assault rifle. His augmented hyperlethal brain knew with mathematical certainty that conventional ballistics were less than useless against the entity standing at the edge of the crater. But the sheer, suffocating aura of the Spartan's suppressed rage was palpable, a dense pressure that made the falling human ash swirl wildly around his massive boots. Over the localized bone conduction comms, Cortana's digital presence was weeping. It was not a sound of audio static. It was a cascading stream of failing algorithms and shattered processing threads as the artificial intelligence desperately, pointlessly, tried to recalculate the life signs of 80,000 extinguished souls. Master Chief finally moved. His heavy boots crushed the frozen, glassy earth with a sound like shattering bone. He stepped directly toward the Monarch of Shadows, closing the distance until he towered over the young man in the black coat. "You traded them," the chief's voice grated through his external helmet speakers. The artificial deepening of the audio could not mask the raw, bleeding humanity underneath. It was stripped of all military protocol, completely devoid of the robotic calm that had defined the Spartan legend. It was the voice of a man who had been surgically altered, psychologically conditioned, and repeatedly broken to serve as humanity's ultimate shield, forced to watch that shield be casually tossed aside by a higher power. 80,000 non-combatants, families trapped in the Vihar transit corridors. You had the power to break the fleet, and you had the power to hold the line over their heads. You chose the path of least resistance. You used their execution to fuel your weapon. Jin-Woo did not turn around immediately. He stood at the edge of the rapidly cooling, glassed crater where the undead supercarrier had momentarily existed. His hands slipped casually into the pockets of his long trench coat. The ethereal, terrifying blue glow in his eyes had dimmed to a cold, starlight simmer, reflecting the violent clarity of the cosmos. When he finally rotated his shoulders to look up at the towering Spartan, his expression was completely unreadable. There was no malice in his gaze. There was no arrogant, godlike cruelty. And most terrifyingly to Thorne, there was absolutely no remorse. "I chose the path of absolute permanent victory," Jin-Woo replied, his baritone voice echoing with the terrifying patience of an immortal who had witnessed the birth and death of 1,000 worlds. "If I had maintained the shield over your distant cities, I would have drained my reserves to the point of vulnerability. The Covenant armada would have realized I was tethered. They would have continued their bombardment indefinitely until the planetary core destabilized. Everyone on this world, including the 80,000 you weep for, would have burned." Jin-Woo took a slow step forward, entirely unfazed by the physical intimidation of the super soldier. "Including you, Spartan, including me. The mathematics of survival in a war of this scale are not clean, they are not noble." The monarch's gaze locked intensely onto the polarized gold visor of the Master Chief, piercing through the armor to the exhausted soul inside. "I did not kill your people. The alien armada fired the weapons that incinerated them. I merely refused to let their fire consume the rest of the board. You are a soldier who fights to save every individual piece, throwing your own body over the pawns. I am a monarch. I fight to kill the enemy king, regardless of the cost. That is why your species is losing this war, and that is why I have never lost." The brutal, undeniable pragmatism of his words hung in the freezing air, an irreversible truth that no amount of human courage or firepower could undo. The 80,000 were gone, and they were never coming back, their sacrifice forever stained by the cold calculus of a god. Before the Master Chief could counter the monarch's dark philosophy, the cracked earth a mile to their east suddenly and violently erased the surviving ground forces entrenched in the deep subterranean bunkers beneath the ash plains. A massive, heavily armored pair of hunter worms, having coalesced into their towering bipedal combat forms, burst upward through the scorched topsoil. They were immediately followed by a desperate, frantic swarm of surviving elite zealots and brute chieftains. Their armor was scorched, their energy shields flickering or entirely dead. Driven utterly mad by the sudden, inexplicable destruction of their holy armada in the sky, the alien remnants did not attempt to flee or regroup. They charged. It was a suicidal, fanatic death march aimed directly at the human-shaped anomaly that had broken their gods. They roared their final, blood-choked war cries, charging their heavy fuel rod cannons and igniting their energy swords, determined to drag the Monarch of Shadows into the abyss with them. Corporal Thorne didn't even reach for his holstered sidearm. He remained kneeling in the gray snow, his eyes wide and vacant. A few hours ago, the sight of 2 charging hunters and a battalion of enraged elites would have triggered a blind, instinctual panic and a desperate fight for survival. Now, the incoming alien horde elicited nothing but a hollow, exhausted pity in the young Marine's chest. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He didn't even need to look at Jin-Woo to know the outcome. The universe had already been solved. The Monarch of Shadows did not assume a combat stance. He did not draw his glowing daggers. He simply exhaled a quiet, misty breath into the freezing air, his eyes never leaving the Master Chief. The shadows stretching out from beneath the charging Covenant horde violently detached from their physical casters. The ground turned into a localized ocean of black ink. Igris, the blood-red knight, materialized from the ether directly above the lead hunter. He did not issue a challenge. His dark greatsword descended in a flawless, silent arc of crackling black lightning that cleanly cleaved the massive, heavily armored beast from its crest to its base, splitting the colony of worms in a spray of orange fluid. Beru, the shrieking ant king, tore through the brute infantry like a living, shadowy buzzsaw. His razor-sharp claws moved too fast for the alien eyes to track, severing limbs and decapitating chieftains before their primitive brains could even register the pain. It wasn't a battle. It lacked the desperate, chaotic energy of combat. It was a mechanical, emotionally barren cleanup operation. The shadows moved with absolute, terrifying efficiency, slaughtering the remnants of the Covenant forces without a single wasted motion. Thorne watched the alien zealots be systematically butchered, realizing with sickening clarity that there was no glory in this violence. It was just the universe correcting a mathematical error. The surviving elites, warriors who had terrorized human colonies for decades, were reduced to pathetic screaming prey, their plasma weapons utterly useless against the intangible nightmare of the Shadow Army. The Master Chief watched the slaughter, his armored fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was a weapon of mass destruction built by the UNSC, engineered to inflict maximum casualties upon the enemy. But even the Spartan recognized that the entity before him operated on a scale of violence that made human morality, military honor, and the rules of engagement entirely irrelevant. The chief slowly turned his helmet down to look at Corporal Thorne. He saw the vacant, shattered stare of a young man who had survived the apocalypse only to lose his fundamental connection to humanity in the process. The Master Chief slowly reached down, his massive armored hand gently gripping Thorne's shoulder guard. The Spartan hauled the young corporal to his feet, a surprisingly tender physical gesture that served as a desperate attempt to anchor the broken Marine back to reality. The fighting ceased as quickly as it had begun. Within 60 seconds, the final Covenant charge was entirely extinguished. The bodies of the aliens were not reanimated. Jin-Woo simply let them fall, their purple blood rapidly freezing on the scorched dirt. The monarch snapped his fingers, and the terrifying shadow commanders instantly dissolved back into the ether, leaving the battlefield to the suffocating quiet of the gray, organic snow. The violent outburst had proven Jin-Woo's point with terrifying finality. The enemy was erased completely and utterly, but the cost of the battlefield was permanently stained with the blood of the innocent. The dead are gone, and the living remain, Jin-Woo spoke, breaking the heavy, agonizing silence that hung between them. He raised his bare hand, and the fabric of reality directly in front of him began to tear once more, pulling back the veil of the physical universe to reveal the chaotic, swirling vortex of a dimensional gateway. Your world is broken, Spartan, but it is yours to rebuild. The Armada will not return to this sector. The empire that sent them will spend the next century looking at the stars in absolute terror, wondering what waits for them in the dark. Jin-Woo stepped toward the portal, his long coat whipping in the unnatural localized winds generated by the dimensional rift. He paused at the threshold, one foot suspended over the void, and cast a final glance back over his shoulder at the Master Chief and the trembling corporal. "Do not let the weight of the sacrificed break your spirit," the Monarch of Shadows commanded softly, his voice echoing with the timeless weight of countless fallen empires. "Carry their ashes. Let the memory of their loss forge you into something that no longer requires a miracle to survive. Because the next time the darkness comes for your species, I will not be here to balance the scales." With a final silent nod, Sung Jin-Woo stepped entirely into the void. The dimensional tear violently snapped shut behind him, sealing the rift with a concussive clap of thunder that echoed across the ruined plains. The oppressive, freezing, magical aura vanished instantly, replaced by the natural, biting cold of the shattered planetary atmosphere. Corporal Thorne stood beside the Master Chief, the ash of 80,000 souls coating their armor, staring into the empty, smoking space where the god of death had stood. They had won the battle for Planet Reach, but as Thorne looked up at the empty, scarred sky, he knew they had lost something far more profound, left entirely alone on a saved, yet irredeemably damned world. The dimensional tear that had swallowed the Monarch of Shadows snapped shut with a sound that defied the natural acoustics of the world. It was not a physical explosion, but a localized implosion of reality itself, a sudden violent vacuum that sucked the remaining oxygen from the immediate airspace before forcefully, violently rejecting it in a concussive shockwave. Corporal Elias Thorne was thrown to his knees, his hands instinctively clutching the sides of his cracked helmet as the pressure equalized with a painful pop in his inner ear. The absolute suffocating silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the Covenant bombardments. The god of death was gone. The alien armada was dust. But the Planet Reach was not at peace. It was dying. The sky above them, previously obscured by the 3-kilometer-long supercarrier and the overlapping firing arcs of a 300-ship alien fleet, was now a bruised, swirling canvas of unnatural twilight. The stars burned with a cold, indifferent clarity through the massive, ragged holes torn into the ozone layer. Thorne stared at his armored hands, coated in the soft, gray biological ash of the 80,000 civilians sacrificed to fuel the Monarch's weapon. The physical threat of the Covenant had been violently erased from the Eridanus sector, but the psychological devastation left in its wake was absolute. The young corporal felt entirely hollowed out, a ghost trapped inside a heavy titanium shell. He had been trained to fight a war of survival against religious zealots, but the last hour had permanently rewritten his understanding of the cosmos. Humanity was not engaged in a grand, tragic struggle for its right to exist. They were merely insignificant bacteria clinging to a rock, entirely at the mercy of unfathomable godlike entities who viewed collateral damage in the tens of thousands as a simple mathematical necessity. Thorne's chest heaved, his breathing shallow and rapid. The paralyzing terror of the alien invasion had been replaced by a deep, freezing nihilism. If survival required the callous execution of the innocent, then what was the point of holding the line? Beside him, the Master Chief did not collapse. The towering Spartan remained an immovable pillar of green armor amidst the falling ash, but the legendary super soldier was visibly bearing the impossible weight of the last 60 minutes. His Mjolnir shielding was entirely depleted, the emitter nodes along his pauldrons sparking with dying, erratic bursts of golden light. The composite armor plating was heavily scorched, scarred by plasma burns, and coated in the same tragic gray snow that covered the young Marine. Inside the localized encrypted comms channel, the digital presence of Cortana was a chaotic storm of fragmented data and hyper-accelerated processing. Her synthesized voice, usually the calm, analytical anchor in the storm of war, was frayed and trembling. "Chief, the tectonic integrity of the Eridanus plate is failing. The localized gravity distortions caused by the Monarch's manipulation of the supercarrier, combined with the extreme thermal shock of the Covenant glassing beams, have permanently fractured the continental shelf." Cortana continued, her voice projecting directly into Thorne's bone conduction receivers. "We are detecting massive subterranean magma surges moving toward the surface. The entire ash plains are going to collapse into a molten caldera within the next 40 minutes. Furthermore, the localized atmospheric pressure is dropping rapidly. The dark matter beam that shattered the armada didn't just destroy the ships, it tore a permanent hole in the thermosphere. The planet is bleeding its atmosphere into the vacuum of space. We cannot stay here. If the magma doesn't incinerate us, the lack of oxygen will suffocate us. The cold, sterile mathematics of their doom were laid bare. The gods had finished their duel and departed, leaving the fragile mortals to burn in the ashes of the arena. Master Chief slowly turned his helmet toward the kneeling corporal. The gold polarized visor reflected the swirling, dying light of the fractured sky, hiding the human eyes beneath. But Thorne could feel the immense, unyielding gravity of the Spartan's gaze. "On your feet, Corporal." The chief's voice was a low, mechanical rumble, stripped of all emotion, a pure, distilled manifestation of military duty. "The war isn't over. The Covenant fleet is destroyed, but there are still 3 million human refugees scattered across the Northern Hemisphere who do not know the sky is clear. The planetary communication grid is entirely down. Orbital Defense Command is blind. We have to send the all-clear signal to the UNSC remnants in the outer system, or those civilians will remain in their bunkers until they starve, or the tectonic collapse buries them alive." Thorne didn't move. He looked up at the towering green giant, his eyes wide and bloodshot behind his cracked visor. "Send the signal?" Thorne's voice cracked, a bitter, hysterical edge bleeding into the open channel. "Did you not see what just happened, Chief? Did you not see what he did to the Vihar corridor? 80,000 people, poof, turned into ammunition for a magic trick. What difference does it make if we call the fleet back? The universe doesn't care if we live or die. The Covenant wants to glass us, and our savior just casually fed us to the meat grinder. It's over. We're just dust waiting to be swept up." The young Marine slammed his ash-covered fists into the scorched earth. A futile, agonizing display of absolute surrender. Just let the ground open up. We don't deserve to survive this, not after what we just watched. The Master Chief stepped forward, the heavy titanium boots crunching loudly against the brittle crust. He did not yell. He did not offer a grand philosophical speech about human resilience. He simply reached down with one massive armored hand, gripped the heavy tactical webbing on Thorne's chest plate, and hauled the corporal to his feet with terrifying, effortless strength. The Spartan leaned in close, his faceplate inches from Thorne's trembling visor. "The universe does not care, Corporal Thorne." The chief's voice was quiet, a steady, unshakable bedrock amidst the psychological collapse. "The Covenant does not care. That entity did not care. That is exactly why we must. If the universe is a cold, indifferent void, then the only warmth, the only justice, the only mercy that exists is what we create with our own hands." The chief released Thorne's harness, giving the young man a sharp, grounding shake. Those 80,000 died because a god decided their lives were an acceptable tactical loss. We do not accept that math. We are human. We carry the weight and we save whoever is left. Now pick up your rifle. The sheer, uncompromising absolute of the Spartan's will hit Thorne like a physical shockwave. The Master Chief was a man who had been stripped of his childhood, turned into a weapon, and forced to carry the survival of an entire species on his shoulders. He had just witnessed the same horrifying, reality-breaking apathy of the cosmos, yet he refused to break. He refused to surrender his humanity to the dark. Thorne looked at his empty, trembling hands, then down at the MA-5B, assault rifle half buried in the gray snow. The paralyzing nihilism began to crack, replaced by a desperate, agonizing spark of purpose. The gods were monsters. The universe was a slaughterhouse, but the towering green armor standing in front of him was a testament to the fact that defiance was still a choice. Thorne slowly bent down, his joints aching, and wrapped his fingers around the grip of his rifle. He pulled it from the ash, the metallic clack of the charging handle echoing loudly in the dead air. "Where are we going, Chief?" Thorne asked, his voice shaking but no longer defeated. "Outpost Echo." Cortana's voice chimed in, projecting a glowing holographic waypoint onto Thorne's heads-up display. It's a deep-crust, localized slip-space communication relay built into the bedrock of the Eridanus mountain range. or at least where the mountain range used to be. It's approximately 3 kilometers north of our current position. The facility is shielded against orbital bombardments, so the primary transmitter should still be intact. But the tectonic shifts have heavily damaged the surrounding topography. We need to move fast. The ground temperature is rising at an exponential rate. The Master Chief gave a single curt nod, adjusting the heavy magnetic grip of his own weapon. Without another word, the Spartan turned and began to march directly into the swirling, unnatural twilight of the ruined ash plains. Corporal Thorne took a deep, ragged breath of the stale, recycled air in his helmet, forced his trembling legs to move, and followed the legend into the dark. The trek across the violently altered landscape was a descent into an entirely new circle of hell. The physical destruction wrought by the Covenant plasma was evident. Massive, glowing craters of molten glass, the twisted, skeletal remains of human armor, and the charred, unrecognizable husks of alien dropships. But it was the lingering, unnatural residue of the Monarch's presence that turned the journey into a psychological nightmare. The dark mana that Jin-Woo had unleashed to power the undead supercarrier had not simply vanished. It had seeped into the very bedrock of Reach, irradiating the environment with a freezing, chaotic energy. The ash plains were no longer just a war zone. They were a violently clashing ecosystem of extreme, opposing thermodynamics. As they marched, Thorne witnessed the impossible. To his left, a massive fissure in the earth spewed a geyser of superheated, glowing red magma, illuminating the sky with the violent heat of the planet's bleeding core. But less than 50 yards to his right, a massive patch of the scorched earth was entirely encased in jagged, glowing black ice. The ambient temperature fluctuated wildly, spiking from a suffocating, blistering heat to a bone-chilling absolute zero from one step to the next. Thorne's armor environmental controls were whining continuously, the internal localized heaters and cooling units fighting a losing battle against the rapidly shifting extremes. Frost would crystallize on his visor, only to violently flash boil into steam a second later. The auditory landscape was equally terrifying. The deep, rumbling groans of the shifting tectonic plates were constantly interrupted by the sharp, acoustic crack of freezing shadow magic, shattering the ambient moisture in the air. "Stay close to my footprint track," the Master Chief ordered over the local comms, his massive frame effortlessly navigating the treacherous, shifting terrain. The dark energy residue is creating localized gravitational anomalies. If you step into a pocket of concentrated shadow, the kinetic friction could either freeze you solid or crush your armor under hypergravity. Thorne swallowed hard, meticulously placing his boots into the heavy, deep impressions left by the half-ton Spartan. The young Marine's heart hammered against his ribs. The Covenant had been an enemy he could understand, flesh, blood, and plasma. But this environmental hazard, this lingering echo of a god's wrath, was a silent, invisible killer that bypassed all military training. It was a stark, continuous reminder of their absolute insignificance in the grand cosmic hierarchy. Suddenly, the ground directly beneath Thorne's feet violently gave way. It wasn't a sinkhole, it was a localized tectonic shear. A jagged fissure 5 feet wide and bottomless tore open with a deafening crack. Thorne pitched forward, his boots slipping on the glassy, melting edge of the newly formed chasm. He threw his arms out, a scream dying in his throat as the dark, crushing abyss opened below him. Before gravity could claim him, a massive, armored hand clamped onto the thick titanium collar of his chest plate. The Master Chief had pivoted with impossible augmented speed, his boots locked onto the solid bedrock as he casually arrested Thorne's fall with one arm. The Spartan hauled the young corporal backward, throwing him roughly onto solid ground. Thorne lay on his back, staring up at the swirling, bruised sky, his lungs burning as he gasped for breath. He had almost died, not from a plasma bolt, but from the simple, violent, indifferent geometry of a dying planet. "Keep your eyes on the horizon, Corporal," the chief commanded, not pausing to check on Thorne's emotional state. The mission was paramount. "We are approaching Outpost Echo. Visual contact established." Thorne scrambled to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest, and looked toward the northern coordinates. His heart sank. The facility, originally a massive, heavily fortified bunker embedded deep within the face of a granite mountain, was now an absolute ruin. The mountain itself had been entirely sheared in half by the kinetic shockwave of the crashing supercarrier. The upper levels of the UNSC base were completely sheared off, exposing twisted metal girders and sparking electrical conduits to the toxic atmosphere. Worse, the base of the facility was surrounded by a massive, bubbling lake of glowing magma, while the primary entrance doors were completely encased in a 30-foot-thick glacier of the Monarch's lingering black ice. The entrance was a chaotic, impossible fusion of extreme heat and extreme cold. "Cortana, what is the status of the primary transmitter?" the chief asked, his tone betraying no hesitation despite the apocalyptic condition of the objective. "The deep crust shielding held," Cortana replied, her voice echoing with digital relief. "The slip space broadcasting array is intact, but the facility's main reactor is entirely offline. The localized EMP generated by the dark matter beam wiped the automated startup sequence. The only way to send the fleet recall signal is to manually initiate a cold start of the fusion reactor from the sub-level engineering bay and then reroute the power to the communication spire." A heavy, terrifying pause followed. "Chief, the sub-level is directly adjacent to the exposed magma flow. The internal temperature of the engineering bay is currently reading at 400 degrees Celsius and rising, and the automated lockdown bulkheads have been physically fused shut by the black ice." They reached the edge of the molten lake. The heat radiating from the bubbling rock was intense enough to warp the visual spectrum, making the air ripple and dance. The massive titanium blast doors of Outpost Echo stood 30 yards away, locked behind the impenetrable wall of freezing shadow magic. "I will breach the doors," the Master Chief stated flatly. He unclipped 2 highly classified, high-explosive-shaped charges from his tactical belt. "I will enter the engineering bay and manually restart the fusion reactor. The Mjolnir armor's thermal gel layer can withstand the ambient temperature of the sub-level for approximately 4 minutes before catastrophic failure." 4 minutes is not enough time to initiate the sequence and manually reroute the power from the central console, Cortana protested, her voice spiking with genuine panic. "Chief, the reactor alignment requires a simultaneous dual input. Someone has to hold the primary fusion rods in place while the secondary command console initiates the spark. You cannot be in 2 places at once. If you enter that room alone, you will burn alive before the signal ever leaves the dish." The Master Chief paused, the high explosive charges resting in his massive palms. The mathematical impossibility of the situation settled over them. The Spartan was willing to sacrifice his life, to burn alive in the dark to save the millions of refugees, but the mechanics of the task demanded 2 sets of hands. The chief slowly turned his helmet toward Corporal Thorne. The young Marine was trembling, his armor scorched, his spirit battered by the traumatic events of the day. The chief knew he could not order a 19-year-old human to walk into a 400-degree furnace. It was a suicide mission, a violation of the very principles he fought to protect. "I will find a way to bypass the dual input," the chief lied, his voice heavy with the grim acceptance of his own end. "Corporal Thorne, you will remain out here. Once the power spikes, you will use the external diagnostic port on the comms spire to broadcast the signal. That is an order." Thorne stared at the towering green armor. He heard the lie. He understood the tactical reality perfectly. The Master Chief, the invincible demon of the UNSC, the absolute pinnacle of human engineering, was going to walk into an oven and die because a god had decided to break their world and leave them to clean up the mess. Thorne looked back down at the gray snow covering his gauntlets. The ash of the 80,000. To save the billions, the thousands must be surrendered to the fire. The monarch's chilling words echoed in his mind. The gods traded lives like currency. They sacrificed the weak to achieve their goals. But Thorne suddenly realized what made humanity fundamentally different. Humans didn't trade lives for power. They traded their own lives for each other. "No, sir." Thorne's voice was shockingly steady, devoid of the hysterical panic that had gripped him earlier. The paralyzing fear was gone, burned away by the sheer, absolute clarity of his choice. He stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the towering Spartan. "You can't hold the rods and hit the console." Cortana said it herself. "And humanity doesn't just need a signal, Chief. They need you. The Covenant might be gone from this sector, but the war isn't over. If the Master Chief burns in a basement on Reach, the morale of the entire UNSC burns with him. You are the shield." Thorne reached down and forcefully detached the heavy magnetic datapad from the Chief's thigh armor. "You breach the door. You hold the fusion rods. I'll run the command console. My armor's environmental seals are still mostly intact. I can survive the heat long enough to hit the spark." Master Chief looked down at the young corporal. The Spartan's augmented mind rapidly calculated the variables, the thermal thresholds, and the probabilities of survival. The math was brutal. Thorne's standard-issue armor would fail long before the Mjolnir suit. The heat would blister his skin, boil his blood, and permanently sear his lungs. It was an agonizing, horrifying price to pay. But as the Chief looked into the cracked visor of the human soldier, he saw the undeniable, brilliant spark of the human spirit. The terrified boy who had cowered in the trenches had been violently forged in the crucible of the apocalypse into a man willing to step into the fire. The after-transformation was complete. The Chief did not argue. He did not offer empty comfort. He recognized the profound dignity of a soldier making the ultimate choice. The Spartan gave a single, slow, respectful nod. "Understood, Corporal," the Master Chief rumbled, his voice carrying the heavy, solemn weight of a commander accepting a soldier's sacrifice. "On my mark, we breach the ice and we do not stop moving until the signal is away." The Chief turned toward the massive, black ice-covered blast doors. He primed the shaped charges, the digital timers blinking a lethal red in the twilight. The planet beneath them groaned, a massive tremor shaking the molten lake, a desperate warning that the tectonic collapse was accelerating. Act 7 had forced the ultimate human choice. The gods had abandoned the stage, leaving a broken world and a seemingly impossible task. But as Thorne tightened his grip on the datapad and prepared to run headfirst into a literal furnace, he felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't an insignificant pawn on a cosmic chessboard. He was Corporal Elias Thorne of the UNSC, and he was about to rip salvation from the jaws of a dying world, proving that even in a universe of dark gods and alien monsters, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. The shaped charges detonated with an ear-splitting crack, banishing the heavy silence of the dying planet. The 30-foot-thick glacier of the Monarch's black ice sublimated instantly under the thermal flash, transforming into a blinding cloud of dark vapor. Before the debris could hit the molten lake below, the Master Chief vaulted through the jagged breach in the blast doors, his Mjolnir armor tearing through the vapor like a green missile. Corporal Thorne was right behind him, his boots slipping on the melting slush, his breath catching as they crossed the threshold into Outpost Echo. The transition was violently absolute. They traded the freezing magical wasteland for the suffocating mechanical hell of a failing reactor core. The heat inside the sub-level engineering bay was not just a temperature, it was a physical, crushing weight. The ambient air was sitting at 400 degrees Celsius and climbing. The internal automated suppression systems had failed hours ago. Warning klaxons blared in a deafening rhythmic loop, accompanied by the strobing glare of emergency red lighting. The air tasted of melting copper, scorched synthetic rubber, and superheated ozone. Thorne's standard-issue marine armor immediately began to scream. Every environmental warning rune on his heads-up display flashed a blinding crimson. The internal cooling gel pack in his undersuit boiled off within the first 10 seconds, turning his protective layer into a scalding sauna. He couldn't breathe. Every inhalation felt like dragging razor blades down his trachea, but he did not stop moving. He locked his eyes on the elevated command console 30 yards away, sprinting across the grating as the soles of his boots began to stick and melt against the floor. Directly below the console, the massive cylindrical fusion reactor was vibrating violently, completely unmoored from its magnetic containment field. The Master Chief leaped down into the containment pit. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his massive armored gauntlets directly onto the glowing superheated fusion rods. The Mjolnir armor's localized energy shields flared a brilliant gold as they clashed with the raw thermal output of the uncontained starfire. The titanium composite plates of the Chief's gauntlets began to glow a dull cherry red. The Spartan planted his boots, his augmented muscles bulging beneath the failing armor, and physically forced the massive rods back into their precise alignment slots. The sheer kinetic effort caused the Chief's armor to groan in mechanical agony. "The alignment is locked!" the Spartan roared over the comms, his voice tight with unimaginable exertion. "Input the sequence, Corporal, now!" Thorne reached the command console. The reinforced glass of his visor was beginning to spiderweb, the extreme heat compromising its structural integrity. His armored gloves were smoking. He slammed the heavy magnetic data pad into the console's override port, his fingers trembling violently from the agonizing pain of first-degree burns creeping across his flesh, danced across the glowing holographic keyboard. He wasn't thinking about the 80,000 souls lost to the Monarch's dark arithmetic. He wasn't thinking about the indifferent, godless universe. He was thinking about the 3 million terrified humans huddled in the dark, waiting for a whisper of hope. He rapidly bypassed the corrupted, automated protocols, forcing a manual cold start sequence. The console shrieked a final warning prompt demanding dual authorization. Thorne smashed his fist down on the execution key, overriding the safety lockout. "Spark initiated," Thorne screamed back, his vocal cords tearing. Deep beneath them, the fusion reactor caught. A low foundational hum vibrated up through the melting floor grates, rapidly escalating into a deafening, triumphant roar. The facility's power grid violently surged back to life. A blinding beam of pure, concentrated microwave telemetry shot straight up the central communication spire, tearing through the fractured bedrock of the mountain and piercing the ruined, bruised sky of Reach. The slipspace transmission broke the atmospheric barrier, echoing out into the cold void of the cosmos. It was an all-clear beacon, a cry in the dark that carried a massive, undeniable data packet. "The Covenant armada is destroyed. The skies are clear. Initiate planetary extraction protocols immediately." The signal was away. The fragile, desperate math of human survival had been successfully recalibrated by 2 soldiers in a burning basement. Thorne collapsed against the console. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving only the agonizing fire in his nerves. His vision went black at the edges. He felt the heavy, unmistakable weight of the Master Chief's arms wrapping around his chest plate, physically lifting him off the melting floor. The Spartan's armor was smoking heavily, the gold visor cracked, but the legend was unbroken. The Chief hauled the unconscious corporal out of the inferno, racing the collapsing tectonic stability of the mountain. When Thorne finally blinked his eyes open, the blistering heat was gone, replaced by the biting, cold wind of the Eridanus Mountains. He was lying on a stretcher. Medical personnel were cutting away his fused armor. He looked up past the medics. The bruised, unnatural twilight of the sky was filled with the beautiful, angular silhouettes of UNSC Pelicans and heavy extraction frigates descending through the atmosphere. The Master Chief stood a few feet away, watching the evacuation fleet arrive. The Spartan looked down at the young corporal. There were no words exchanged, only a silent, profound understanding of the cost they had paid. Thorne would bear the agonizing scars of this day for the rest of his life. The 80,000 civilians were permanently gone, traded by a god to balance the scales. The ash plains were ruined, but as Thorne listened to the roar of the human dropships coming to save the remaining 3 million, his soul was finally at peace. He understood now that humanity would never possess the unimaginable power of the Monarch of Shadows. They could not rewrite the laws of physics or resurrect the dead, but they possessed something far more resilient. They possessed the chaotic, beautiful willingness to burn themselves alive, to light the way for others. And against the cold, indifferent dark of the universe, that was more than enough.